Welcome to Energy Talks, the podcast for energy nerds and inquisitive folks who enjoy interesting conversation. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop. Today's guest is Pranav Jaswani, technology analyst at IDTechEx and author of a new report titled Micro-EVs 2025 to 2045, Electric Two-Wheelers, Three-Wheelers, and Microcars. So welcome to welcome back to Energy Talks, Pranav.
Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be back here.
Well, let's talk about it. I think we all know what two-wheelers are. Um, uh, are those what is a two-wheeler? What is a three-wheeler? What is a microcar? And how are all three of those different types of transportation used, particularly in Asia, where there's the big market for micro EVs?
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to two and three wheelers, it kind of is what it says on the tin. Anything that has two wheels or three wheels, we don't count bicycles, we don't count bikes, which might have, a little bit of battery pack attached to the frame, but essentially mopeds, motorcycles, things like that are typically what you'd include into a two-wheeler. Three-wheelers are a bit more ambiguous, or they're not really as pervasive within the collective consciousness of people, but they are very popular in Asia, as you say. So motorized three-wheeled motorcycles, essentially often with cargo holds attached to the back where you can carry goods around back and forth. And microcars are just small versions. You might have seen things like a smart car or a certain Renaults or Citroens, which are quite small. They typically fit around two people, not really much space for goods, not really a trunk to be spoken about. But really, all these vehicles sort of fit within a common theme of they're very applicable to use in cities. They're not really meant for long haul travel. They don't hit high speeds. They don't have the longest range. They're not going to carry multiple suitcases. But they do fit within this niche because they are very easy to park. They're very easy to move around. You can charge them pretty easily, pretty quickly, and they're less expensive. So it's better for the user as well.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So I actually assumed that a two-wheeler would include an electric bike. I've got a
Mhm.
couple in the garage. I've been riding an e-bike for 4 years. Absolutely love it. But that is not they don't fit into that category. And I assume, so we're talking about vehicles, two-wheel vehicles, electric vehicles that people are using for work. Is that like to get back and forth to work, or they're delivering something? Apparently there's a big e-commerce boom in Asia, so that's a favorite way for delivery, people to deliver packages. Have I got that right?
Yeah, basically, I'm the where the distinction really lies is whether you can power the vehicle yourself or is it entirely powered by the battery. So when we say two-wheelers, electric two-wheelers, we talk about mopeds and motorcycles because if you look at an e-bike, that's something you can pedal yourself. It's not entirely reliant on the battery. So that's typically where we draw the line. You could use either of those. You could use an e-bike or an electric two-wheeler for e-commerce delivery. When you order food on an app, they might come to you on an e-bike, it's pretty common, or on a motorcycle, that's common too. Um, but yes, in general, there are these emerging applications for these vehicles as well.
What kind of price range are we talking about for these two-wheelers?
Um, so in Asia, where you see them used for everyday transport, they are really cheap. They could be $500 to $2,000. You look at things like US and Europe markets where they're not yet currently used for that application. They're more used for recreation. You want to go out on the weekend and just race a bike for a little bit. Those are obviously more expensive. That would be multiple thousands of dollars up to 10 or 15K.
Okay. And one of the things I've noticed in China in particular is the idea of battery swapping so that you
Yes.
don't, is that catching on in India?
Not currently in India. So when we look at the batteries of these small vehicles, they're obviously quite small and they're pretty quick to charge in the first place. So battery swapping is an option which is the ultimate convenience for the user. It takes a couple minutes to swap. It's pretty light, the battery, so it's not really difficult for anyone to do it. But because they're so small and they can charge quickly, and their range is typically sufficient for what you might need in a day, let's say 60 to 80 kilometers. You could just charge it overnight, like you would a car, and you can use it throughout the day, come home and charge it again. Um, Really, there are certain markets which are taking on battery swapping, places like China and Taiwan, but India has sort of stuck with the conventional charging methods.
Um, China has dominated this market for a long time, but it looks like the electric micro EVs are going to catch on
Mhm.
in India. Why is India sort of behind the curve?
Well, they've generally been slower to electrify in the first place. China has been very proactive in electrification of virtually every vehicle segment. They have the technological edge, they have the financial edge typically, and they have a lot of incentive to carry this out. A lot of the battery suppliers and manufacturers are based in China as well. India has really been missing that infrastructure up to now, but they have recently been more proactive in pushing this as well. So if you look at China, where they really started this push towards electrification of two-wheelers back in the mid 90s, I think. In India, it's really only started in the mid 2010s, but they have passed a lot of regulation. They have made it much easier for manufacturers and battery suppliers to enter the market. So you're really seeing all of this bear fruit now, actually. Yeah.
Let's talk about microcars because that's something. I mean, you mentioned the EV Smart, which is a smart EV.
Yeah.
Sorry, the smart car, which is a two-seater and it's pretty small.
Yeah.
Is that a micro car? Obviously it is, but what about small four-seaters? Like we've seen one. There was one in Europe. I think it came out of France. It looked the same going and coming, and it was very, very inexpensive. I think probably around $5,000 or maybe a bit more, and it was really designed for it was designed for young people who are just starting out, folks who need to commute within a crowded urban environment. Is 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 have I got that kind of right of what a microcar is?
Yeah, exactly. So I think in Europe they call that a quadricycle, basically. So it's pretty small. It is also two-doored, I believe, and it is mostly meant for short range travel. You can be licensed to operate a quadricycle as young as 16 or even 14 in some European countries, and that fits perfectly into what we might call a microcar. The tricky part with microcars is that they're sort of defined differently depending on where you go. So in Europe, it's something like that. In Japan, it's a K car, which you probably would have heard of already. It's much higher power. They're probably 50 kilowatts of power. They're used on highways as well in some cases. So it is a spectrum, and depending on who you ask, you might get different answers. But in general, they all will help to serve the same function.
Yeah, there are a lot of mega cities in Asia, and it would
Yeah.
seem that electric or micro EVs would be a logical solution both to crowding and also to air pollution. Uh, is that what we're seeing here? Is the local governments, maybe state and national governments, are pushing micro EVs to solve some of these other problems?
Yeah, so the pollution problem in particular is one. I mean, anyone who's traveled to Asia will know what the traffic is like, but they'll also know that motorcycles, two and three wheelers are already being used. So the government sees their electrification as a pretty good way of achieving reductions in air pollution, pretty good way of reducing emissions generally to fall in line with sort of Paris Agreement accords and similar treaties and such. Um, it is also picking up some steam in terms of the e-commerce segment. You mentioned that earlier. And that is, again, a way of counteracting some of the traffic that we see.
Yeah, that e-commerce part of this intrigues me because we're seeing a lot of, a big increase, and we've seen it in North America.
Yeah.
And but here the delivery is I think is now done with a gas-powered delivery van.
Hmm.
But Amazon, I think, is contracted for like 100,000 electric vans,
Yeah.
and that seems to be the trend. But why then would the say a two-wheeler be more suitable to India?
Well, there are obviously cost concerns. A two-wheeler is always going to be cheaper. And if you can fit enough cargo space around it. So cargo boxes for a two-wheeler might be half the size of a commercial van, but that's still a pretty good return. And if you look at the actual operational profile of a lot of these cargo vehicles for e-commerce or last mile delivery, they have to stop and start really often. When you're going through neighborhoods, you have to stop, get off, drop off a package, go back, get going again. So you need to park quite a lot, and parking is a lot easier with a smaller vehicle. And if it's electric, you can actually benefit from stopping and starting because you can brake regeneratively. So it's actually better on an energy efficiency standpoint as well, and you get to reduce your energy cost in the long run.
One of the I've watched some videos of
Hmm.
two and three wheelers at work in Asia,
Sure.
and they're very creative. You know, if you put a bed on the back, and I remember this one, there was a construction site, and they sent a worker off to get some two by fours or whatever it was they
Yeah.
needed, and they got it quickly. Plenty of room in the bed. Put it on the on the bike, and away they went, and they got back in a hurry. And it seems like, maybe if you're building a, like an office tower and in one of the big cities, you wouldn't use it for that. But I could see like in neighborhoods where you're building houses or you're building something, your construction projects are small. Those seem actually absolutely perfect.
Yeah, definitely. I've been to a factory in China. This is probably a bit anecdotal, but the factory's in two separate buildings, and instead of having a conveyor belt transfer goods from one to the other, they just strap it off the back of a motorcycle and have someone drive it the other side. So it's already being used that way. And yeah, I'm guessing most of those are probably gas, but there's no reason why you can do that with an electric two-wheeler as well. It's the same application, and people are really creative with the way they use these things because they are so nimble and they're so flexible in what they can do.
What about the displacement of oil? Like, I think I've seen some numbers. Bloomberg NEF, for example,
Mhm.
estimates that two and three wheelers are already displacing over 1 million barrels a day of oil demand. Are we going to see that accelerate as the number of micro EVs increases in Asia?
Yes, that would be my expectation. So we are expecting that the micro EV sector is generally going to grow and eat into the existing market share of combustion-driven two-wheelers and three-wheelers, for example. Um, Maybe less so in China because China they sort of have some stagnation in the future. You know, there's trending towards bigger vehicles as their income increases, but developing countries like India or those in Southeast Asia, and even in Europe where traffic might be more of a concern, we will expect greater number of electric two and three wheelers. Yes.
What about the ability of the power grid to provide enough electricity? I mean, this is already an issue in rapidly
Hmm.
growing emerging economies. So the grid can't keep up. Um, so A, can the grid keep up? And B, is there an opportunity here, or are we already seeing the trend where distributed energy, like solar panels, for example? And in fact, this I thought this was a great compliment. I was reading an article about, balcony panels, where you get solar
Hmm.
panels that you essentially plug into your 110 volt, into your wall socket, and it supplies energy to your house, and you can put them on your garage roof or your
Yeah.
balcony or your patio, whatever, wherever you've got room. And the combination of those cheap panels plus a micro EV seems like a logical combination, especially if you've got troubles with your grid, in your area.
Yeah, that's definitely a possible avenue for the future. So nothing like that has really been rolled out in any sort of concerted effort. You might have individuals who are doing that for themselves, but I could definitely see those two facets being compatible. In terms of the ability of the grid, that's really going to depend on, I mean, it faces many of the same issues as you might see in automotive with cars. What I can say is that every person that's in a two and three wheeler is not in a car. So it's easier for the grid to handle these sort of loads than you might see for automotive loads, I would say.
Now, you're forecasting that in your base case that the micro EV segment will reach 90 billion US dollars
Mhm.
by 2045. What is it now?
Um, that's a good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. I do believe it is in the single digit billions, I would say. It's expected to grow quite a bit, especially within the two-wheeler segment, which is already the biggest one.
Right, and I can see that. I mean,
Mhm.
it would appear that China has got this electrification strategy that is part of their larger economic strategy and geopolitical strategy. I can see where, changes to the what's the word I'm looking for? Demography, their
Yeah.
population and age and so on is going to favor cars versus two and three wheelers. Um, but in India, which is where you're saying most of the growth will take place
Mhm.
over the next 20 years, um, what is the government encouraging the manufacture of these micro EVs and then the adoption of the micro EVs the way China did?
Yeah, so they're actually creating programs and incentives throughout the value chain. So when you start with production, they're making they're putting incentives in place to bring battery manufacturing into India, both from foreign manufacturers, but also developing domestic manufacturing capacity for batteries, in particular with an eye towards electric two and three wheelers. They're making it much cheaper and easier to do that. On the purchasing end, they have had incentives in place since 2019, I believe, where for every electric two and three wheeler that you buy, you are eligible for a certain amount in rebate, and that depends on the size of the battery within the vehicle itself. So when you factor that in, you could actually end up with the electric version being cheaper than the combustion version, and that's really been an important driver for uptake as well. Um, They've renewed that sort of policy since 2019 up to now, just recently, earlier this year. So it's something they're looking to continue because it has been so successful.
And I gather that the government is pouring a fair amount of resources into manufacturing, both the plants to manufacture the micro EVs as well as the supply chains. I mean, everybody knows that, China has got a lock on the
Yeah.
battery supply chains. Um, is this a strategy within India to encourage the electrification of transportation? Because we understand, that there are already a number of auto manufacturers like Tata that are electrifying, and so is this part of a bigger trend? And the government also wants to build out the supply chains and then the mineral and battery metal refining as well.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe less so on the core materials that go into the batteries, but in terms of adopting electric vehicles generally, yes. So two-wheelers are, I would say, the dominant mode of transport in India. So they have been most subject to this sort of incentive and this sort of help from the government. But electric buses have seen a boost. Electric commercial vans have seen a boost. So really, it is part of an overall concerted effort. Yes. Yeah.
So any issues that we maybe should talk about but haven't talked about yet?
Well, in truth, electric two and three wheelers are pretty developed. They don't really face many of the same challenges that you might see with electric cars, where you're constantly looking to increase range, make charging faster. The products as they are today are fairly well suited to the applications that they're intended for. The only thing that might happen is an increase in power output. So if you're going to be using these vehicles for e-commerce, they're going to have to carry large, heavy loads. You might want more powerful motors, maybe slightly bigger batteries, but that's something that does develop incrementally as well. And we are seeing that trend upwards.
Well, I thought of one other question I wanted to ask you, and why your report is calling for most of the growth to come from India. What about some of the other Asian, Southeast Asian economies? Um, and are we likely to see a big uptake of micro EVs over the next 20 years?
Yes, definitely. So within Southeast Asia, electric three-wheelers have never been really common, and three-wheelers as a whole are less pervasive there, but two-wheelers are, and we have seen strong growth there too. So Vietnam is already the third largest market for electric two-wheelers. Indonesia is fourth. So Southeast Asia, in particular, is a large and quickly growing market. Um, Thailand and the Philippines would probably say come after that. Turkey is a big one as well. But we don't, yeah, I mean, Southeast Asia is definitely what you point at instead of Europe or the US for two and three-wheeler growth in the future.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Pranav. We'll
Thank
look
you.
forward to our next conversation.
Yes, thanks.